Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik 8. We will be learning today Amir Hashem Daf Kuf Chaf Vav Amid Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchas Yom Tov. We pick up today in Siman Taf Kuf Yud in the midst of Sif Beis. So we're actually beginning from the top line of Kuf Chaf Vav Amid Beis by the words Bamed Dvarim Amurim in the Mechaber. So let's just remind ourselves what it was that the Mechaber had been saying since the beginning of Sif Beis. We're discussing the malacha of Berurah when we separate something out from a mixture. We know that Berurah is an av malacha. It's a malacha that's asar on Shabbos. What is the status of Berurah on Yom Tov? So the Mechaber said over here in Sif Beis that if one wants to perform the malacha of Berurah, let's say on selecting beans, let's say somebody has beans and there's psilus, there's refuse of some type, debris, let's say, mixed in together with the beans, and maybe there's good beans and bad beans, and maybe there's pebbles, etc., or there's pieces of chaff from where the beans were separated from their stalks, and you want to do Berurah, you want to separate out the garbage from the beans. So the Mechaber said in the beginning of Sif Beis on Kuf Chavav Amad Aleph, I'll just read his words, Berurah kitnius b'Yom Tov. If somebody wants to perform Berurah on legumes on Yom Tov, the Mechaber said Berurah kedarkoi. He can do this in the normal fashion. And the Mishnah Berurah explained that what that means, Berurah kedarkoi, that he could do it in the normal fashion, is he's even allowed to take out the psilus from the eichel. He's allowed to take out the undesirable parts of the mixture from the eichel, from the beans, from the part that you want to keep. Now that would typically be the av malacha of Berurah. And yet on Yom Tov you're allowed to do this, but the Mechaber gave us a caveat. He said you could do it b'cheikoi u'betamchoi. He said you're allowed to do this on your lap or using a tamchoi. A tamchoi is a large tray that you use for this shaking. It's a tray, not a large tray. That might be a tabla. It's a tray that you put the entire mixture on and you shake it, and that ends up separating out the legumes and the chaff and the garbage. So you're allowed to do this. Why? Because we paskin like Beis Hillel. We know that there's a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Beya, a Mishnah in Masechtas Beya, Yudalan Amid Beis, where Beis Hillel says that you are allowed to perform the malacha of Berurah on Yom Tov. And the Mechaber said, therefore, you're allowed to do this. However, he said, Avaloi b'tavla, v'loi b'napa, v'loi b'kavara. While you're allowed to do it b'cheikoi u'b'tamchui, you're allowed to do it on your lap or using a small sorting tray. You're not allowed to do it with a napa, with a kavara. So you're not allowed to do this either with a tavla, which is a very large sorting tray, or a napa or a kfara, which are different types of sieves and sifters. That you're not allowed to do. So how do we understand the status of Berurah on Yom Tov? We paskin like Beis Hillel, at least the Mechaber is paskin here like Beis Hillel, that Berurah essentially is mutter on Yom Tov if you're doing it l'tzarech chaychel nefesh. However, you cannot do it doing it in the typical way with the typical kalim that you would normally use if you were doing this liyamim harbe. If you use a tavla or you use a napa or a kavara, then it looks like you're doing this not just l'tzarech hayoim. It looks like you're not only doing it for Yom Tov use, you're doing it even for the chayil. You're doing it for after Yom Tov as well. It looks like you're doing a malacha liyamim harbe. And we know that a malacha liyamim harbe, that is certainly asar on Yom Tov. That's certainly something that you are not allowed to perform on Yom Tov. And therefore the Chazal said you can't do it in that way. Now we pick up on the top of Kuf Chavav Amid Beis, where the Mechaber says, Bamed Dvarim Amurim. When is this said that you're allowed to perform Berurah in the typical way, so that you're allowed to take the psilus, you're allowed to take the refuse away from the eichel? That's the typical way that Berurah is done. When are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? Kisha ha'eichel meruba al ha'psilus. That's in a typical mixture when you have more eichel than you do psilus. Then we tell you that on Yom Tov, go ahead and do the Berurah and remove the psilus from the eichel. Aval, however, If we're talking about a mixture here where you have more psilus than you do have eichel, then Berurah ha'eichel, then we would rather that you select out the eichel from the mixture, and leave over the psilus. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and ches, kisheha-eichel meruba. When it's a typical mixture, we have more eichel than you do have psilus. Then explains the Chavetz Chaim, da'az taiv yoser livrara psilus. Then we would rather that you take out the psilus from the eichel and you do berurah in the typical fashion, because it's a malacha that's mutter on Yom Tov l'tzarech eichel nefesh, shetirchasai me'uta, because by taking out the psilus from the eichel, you'll have less tircha. On Yom Tov, we don't want you to have tircha yisera. So since berurah is mutter anyway, so go ahead, do it in the normal fashion, take out the psilus from the eichel. But if the eichel is meruba on the psilus, if the psilus is meruba on the eichel, if there's more psilus than there is eichel, then we don't want you to sit there and take away all the psilus. That's going to be much more tircha. So then we would tell you, no, then go ahead and take the eichel away from the psilus and don't work so hard. Continues the Chavetz Chaim in nice cut and ches. V'im shavin b'kamusan. If it happens to be that they're equal, the psilus and the eichel, then then you could select whichever one you want. However, im ha'eichel hudak, if the eichel portion of the mixture is very, very small and very fine, so there's going to be more tircha involved in picking out the eichel, then even if it's 50-50, yivrar ha'psilus. So then take out the psilus to make your life easier. Let's continue in the Mechaber. The Mechaber continues, by me it's on the second line near the end of the line. If the job of separating the psilus from the eichel is is going to be harder than taking the eichel away from the psilus. Let's say you have a mixture where there is more psilus than eichel. So the Mechaber said, if there's more psilus than eichel, then take the eichel away from the psilus to work less. But sometimes, even though there's more psilus than eichel, sometimes if the eichel is very fine, it might be harder to pick out the eichel, even though there's more of it. So then take the psilus to work less. We don't want you to have tircha yisera. So then, afa pisha eichel meruba, even though there's more eichel than psilus, since it's harder to pick out the eichel, then Berurah avapisha eichel meruba, even if the eichel is more, if it's going to be harder to take out the psilus, then Berurah eichel, then take out the eichel and leave the psilus. So the rule of thumb, again, over here, is that Berurah l'tzarech eichel nefesh is mutter, and therefore you're allowed to do Berurah tzarech eichel nefesh as long as you're doing it in a way that does not seem like it's something that you're doing liyamim harbe. So you're not using the typical kind of keli where it looks like you're doing it even for the chayil. Then Berurah is essentially mutter, and therefore it's okay even to take psilus mitay chaychel. You're allowed to do even that. However, what the Mechaber is telling you is it's going to depend on the case. We want you to do whatever is going to be less of a tircha. If it's less of a tircha to take the eichel from the psilus, then take the eichel from the psilus. If it's less of a tircha to take the psilus from the eichel, then take the psilus from the eichel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Test, Tarach Yoser. Let's say it's going to be harder to take the psilus from the eichel. Kigain shap psilus hudak ma'oid. If the psilus is very, very fine, v'yesh tarach rav levararam, and it's going to be a lot of work to take the psilus away from the eichel. So then take the eichel away from the psilus. Now says the Ramah, Hagah, v'luzim ubatnim. Luzim and batnim are both types of nuts. Usually we translate luzim as hazelnuts. I've seen batnim translated as peanuts. However, I think there's an issue over here of translating batnim as peanuts, because this is coming from the Torah. And many point out that during the days of the Torah, they didn't really have, at least in the locale where the Torah lived, they didn't have peanuts. Peanuts, I think, were a Central American food or a South American food, and they didn't have the Torah was not exposed to peanuts. We know that butnim is also in the pasuk, butnim ushkedim. I'm not sure exactly what type of nut butnim are, but it's some type of nut. So the Ramah says, "Veluzimu butnim." You have these nuts, shenishtabru, and they were already broken open. Va'adayin b'klipehem. However, the heart of the nut, the meat of the nut, is still inside the shells. So I guess this is easiest to imagine if you imagine walnuts. So you have a bunch of broken open walnuts, but even after you break open a walnut, the meat of the nut is still embedded in the shell. After you break it open, you have to pull out the meat from the shell. So you have nuts that are broken open, but the meat is still in the shell. Loi mikri haklipa psilus. The shell of the nut is not called psilus. Kevin de urchayu bahachi va'adayin me'uravin. This is not considered a mixture of eichel and psilus because, and these are the words of the Ramah says that this is the way, this is the nature of the nut. It was never separated out. It's called one min. Let's take a look at what the Mishnah Berurah says here. The Mishnah Berurah says, in Eis Katan Yod, Lo mikri haklipa psilus. When you have this broken open walnut, let's say, we're not going to say that you have a mixture of eichel and psilus. The meat of the nut is the eichel and the shell is the psilus. And now if you separate it, you're doing berurah and you're separating eichel and psilus. We don't say that. The Mishnah Berurah says why? Ukemin echad dami. Because since that's the way that the nut is created, that's the nut in its natural state, before you separate the meat and the shell, it's called min echad. That's walnut. When you pick up the shell with the meat embedded in it in your hand, you're not holding a mixture of walnut meat and walnut shell. You're holding a walnut. Ukemin echad dami. That's min echad. Ube'eze inyan shemesake na eichel mitaycha shomer, by being misakin the eichel, by preparing the meat of the nut for eating, by extracting it from its shomer, from the nut, from the shell that protects it. Tikun eichel ba'almahu, that is called tikun eichel. That's called improving the food. That's not considered an act of berurah or separating out from a mixture. V'yachal livrar echad mechaveroi eze sheyirtze, and you're allowed to separate it in any way that you want. V'ayid ba'achrayim, however, he says, take a look at the achrayim sheheskimu, who agree to mikam makayim af bekan yivrar eze shekal yoisel livrar. That still and all, even though we're not calling this berurah, you should do the berurah in whatever the easier fashion is. If it's easier to pull the shell off the nut, pull the shell off the nut. If it's easier to extract the meat from the shells, do it that way. Now, I have to say that this Ramah and this Mishnah Berurah is something that the Achronim mutchetzach with. They work very hard on this because the svara that the Ramah seems to be saying over here, he seems to be saying that this is not called a mixture because the meat of the nut and the shell, it's all min echad, and therefore it's not considered berurah. It's not considered separating anything. Now, if we said that in the context of Hilchos Shabbos, it would take away a lot of our berurah shilas. For instance, one of the classic examples of berurah is taking the watermelon seeds out of the watermelon. You're taking psilas mitaycha eichel. You're taking refuse. You're taking the pit, which is not edible, that you want to throw away. You're extracting it from the eichel, from the meat of the watermelon. So we always look at that as classic berurah. Now, according to what the Mishnah Berurah is saying here, it sounds almost as if, what do you mean? The watermelon, as long as the seed is still embedded in the watermelon, it's min echad. It's all one species. It's all watermelon. It's not considered a mixture of eichel and psilas. And certainly we don't say that in the context of Hilchos Shabbos. So how to apply this svara of the Ramah is something which is very complex. But this is what the Ramah says over here. The Ramah said. Now, the other question is exactly why this has to be mentioned over here. We're saying that berurah is essentially mutter on Yom Tov. So what's the problem over here? So you're extracting the meat from the shell by the nut. That's tzarech echel nefesh, And certainly it's not something, you're not doing it with a keli, and it doesn't look like you're doing it liyamim harbe. People typically crack open a nut and they take out the nut to eat the nut, and they do it for immediate use. They don't do it for 3 months at a time. So it doesn't look like something that you're doing liyamim harbe. So in the context of Hilchos Yom Tov, it's hard to imagine why you would think that this is something that was usher. Unless there's something that I'm missing over here. Okay. Now we go to Siv Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Ein misanenim hachardol damisnenes shaloi. You're not allowed to sift mustard using a mustard seed sifter. Apparently, there was the mustard seed. I guess it has some sort of chaff that it has to be separated from, and there was a mustard sifter. So you're not allowed to sift mustard with a mustard sifter. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Yud Aleph, Ein misanin and achardol. You're not allowed to sift the mustard from its chaff, the mustard seed, using a mustard sifter. Why not? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the mersi kibur, because it looks like bur. Shemashlech al yedei zeh hasubin shaloi. Because what do when you sift the mustard seed from its chaff? You take the mixture of the chaff and the seed, you put it in a sifter, you sift it, the mustard seed, the good mustard seed falls through, and now you're left with the psilus, and you go ahead and you throw it away. So he says this is mechsi, it looks like it's regular bur, and since it's mechsi kebur, shamashlich al yedei hazeh hasubin shaloi, you throw away the subin, so it mamish looks like bur, and that's why it's usher. Now, right away, the question that we have is, what do you mean, Rabbi Weiss? You've been telling me here steadily that bur is mutter on Yom Tov. So why is this usher? Because it's mechsi kebur. Bur itself is mutter if you're doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. So what's the problem that it's mechsi kebur? What's the problem? So the truth is, if you take a look over here in the Sha'ar Tzia, nice cut ches, he says va'af lamad the pasuk haramol el, and according to what the Ramah paskin, that it says here Sif Aleph, it's a mistake. It should be Sif Beis. The af lahaniach shari. If you remember in Sif Beis earlier, the Ramah stuck in the words on the bottom line of Kuf Chavav Amid Aleph, Imroitza la'achloi boy bayayim, that you're allowed to do Berurah on Yom Tov even if you're not doing it miyad, even if you want to do Berurah so that you should eat something 5 hours from now. Usually one of the tanoim for Berurah to be mutter on Shabbos is it has to be miyad, it has to be for immediate consumption. But the Ramah told us that Berurah on Yom Tov is mutter l'tzarech eichel nefesh. And therefore, it doesn't even have to be miyad. As long as it's for Yom Tov use at some point on that day on Yom Tov, Berurah is mutter. So the Sha'ar Tzia is saying over here, what do you mean? Berurah is mutter. Bishum the Berurah hutter b'Yom Tov. So what are you telling me that sifting the mustard seed is also because it's mechsi k'Berurah? So the Sha'ar Tzia and the Chavetz Chaim explains here, Gam Kain Aser, still sifting the mustard seed is forbidden, Mishum da Asli Liyamim Harbe, because this again is the caveat to the heter of Berurah. Yes, essentially Berurah is a malacha that's mutter on Yom Tov l'tzarech eichel nefesh. But the same way we forbade Berurah if you're using a tabla, a napa, or a kavra, because it looks like you're doing it liyamim harbe, the typical way of sifting mustard seed, when you used a mustard sifter, that was a malacha that was usually done liyamim harbe. You prepared a lot of mustard at one time. So you prepared, let's say, a month's worth of mustard at once. You didn't sit down with a pastrami sandwich and sift a little bit of mustard to grind up mustard for one sandwich, l'tzarech hayom. So if somebody sees you using a mustard sifter, it looks like you're preparing a batch of mustard, which is for a month, or for 2 months, or 3 months. And that's why it's usher. So again, when the Mechaber says over here, Ein misanin machardol b'misnenes shaloi, that you're not allowed to sift the mustard seed using a mustard sifter, the reason is because it looks like an avuda rabbah. It looks like you're doing it liyamim harbe. It looks like you're doing it not just for tzarech eisei hayom, for today of Yom Tov, you're doing it for an extended period of time. And the Sha'ar Tzia ends off Eis Ches by saying, Ve'efshar gam kein de dami l'napo kvara. It's similar to doing Berurah with a napa or a kvara, which is usher because it looks like an avuda rabbah. Now, let's go back to Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Aleph, right by the Eis Katan test for the Sharatzia, and Mishnah Berurah ends off, and he says, this is also because it's a mechsi keber. Aval ber mamish loy, it's not really the malacha of ber, shegama pseilis roi la'achila. He points out over here that, and really, again, ber is mutter, but what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you over here, the whole Isser over here has nothing at all to do really with the malacha of Berurah, because you're not even really doing the malacha of Berurah, because it happens to be that when you sift mustard seed, and again, I don't know what the facts on the ground are, I don't know the mitzias of mustard seed, but apparently when you sift the mustard seed, you're not separating something that's edible from something which is inedible. Apparently, both the psilis and the eichel, the part that you're separating away that you don't want, and the mustard seed that you do want, they're both usable and they're both edible. And therefore, this is not really Berurah, because you're not separating psilis and eichel. They're both eichel. Now, the truth is, and Achronim point this out, that, what do you mean? You can have the malacha of Berurah even when you separate eichel from eichel. If you separate peas and carrots, you're also not separating psilis and eichel. You're separating two eichlim. You're separating peas and carrots. But over here by the chardal, apparently both parts that you're separating apart, the mustard seed and the part that you don't want, they're both mustard. So it's a mamish, a min echad. It's not considered really an act of Berurah at all. But it's aser because it's a mechsi keber. It looks like you're doing the malacha of Berurah liyamim harbe, and that's why this is aser. Eis Katan Yud Beis. The Mechaber said that when are you not allowed to sift the mustard? When you do it by misnenes shaloi, when you do it using its sifter, when you use a typical mustard sifter, that's when you're not allowed to do it. Says the Chavetz Chaim. L'chayra mashma mizeh, the implication from the Mechaber's words are that you're not allowed to sift mustard using a mustard sifter. But the imisanein al davar acher shaloi kedarkoi mutter. But if you're using a different implement, then it's mutter. The dunya de sif beis, and this is very similar to what we said in sif beis. D'lo yechmiru ela benapa ukavara mishum shekein derech birasai b'chayil. The only reason this is aser is for the same reason that we said you're not allowed to sift the beans or other legumes using a napa or a kvara, because that's the typical way that you do it liyamim harbe. And that's why it's aser over here with a mustard sifter, because that's liyamim harbe. Kasev Magen Avram, the Magen Avram writes, if you weren't able to do this sifting on Erev Yom Tov, then you're allowed to do it even with a sifter. Then you're allowed to do it even with a sifter. Now, the implication of this Magen Avram, what's the Magen Avram seem to be saying? If we take the words of the Mishnah Berurah here at face value, quoting this Magen Avram, it sounds like the Magen Avram is saying, yes, you're not allowed to sift mustard with a mustard sifter on Yom Tov. But how about if it was EF Shalasai Miba'id Yom? Let's say you couldn't sift the mustard on Erev Yom Tov. Maybe you didn't have mustard seed on Erev Yom Tov. And now your neighbor just came in and he gave you mustard seed. So now you want to go ahead and you want to sift the mustard for your Yom Tov meal. And it's EF Shalasai Miba'id Yom. So now, says the Magen Avram, now you could use the sifter. Now, that flies in the face of the way we learned Pshat in this whole Isser. The way we learned Pshat in this Isser over here is that the whole reason you're not allowed to do this is because it looks like you're doing it liyamim harbe. The problem isn't that you're doing a malacha that you're really not allowed to do, and it's not that you're doing a malacha that was efshar la'asosai miba'id yom. No, that's not the problem at all. Berurah is mutter. So what's the Magen Avram telling me? That if you couldn't do it miba'id yom, now it's mutter. What do you mean? And also, this is mamish eichel nefesh. This is not machshirei eichel nefesh. By machshirei eichel nefesh, we have a difference between whether it was efshar la'asosai miba'id yom or it was efshar la'asosai miba'id yom. But this isn't machshirei eichel nefesh. This is eichel nefesh gufa. I'm doing it to the food itself. So why? This is not machshirei eichel nefesh. So what's the Magen Avram telling me over here? So this question is really the topic of the Bir Halacha Dibra Maschil Ein Misanin. He discusses this over here, but it's a very difficult to understand Magen Avram. Okay. Now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. By me, it's 2 lines off the bottom near the end of the line. Says the Mechaber, Vein mematkin oisai begacheles shel eitz aval b'shal matchis mutter. This is something that we mentioned before. I think we mentioned this in Siman Taf Kuf Zayin. We mentioned this concept. Apparently, when they used to prepare mustard, what they would do is they would take a burning hot coal and they would shove a burning hot coal into the pile of the mustard seed. That would extinguish the coal, and somehow this would have an effect of sweetening the mustard. I don't know if this was a caramelizing effect, if somehow the hot coal caramelized the mustard, or it was some kind of a smoking effect. I'm not 100% sure. Shlomo Zalman, maybe you could research it and let me know. So, but anyway, this was the process of making the mustard. They would submerge that burning hot coal in the mustard. And this, the Mechaber says, you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to do this process of submerging a hot wooden coal into the mustard seed, but you're allowed to use a burning hot piece of metal. That you are allowed to do. And by the way, just for the fact that they would do this with metal, it seems that it's not really a smoking process. It sounds more like it's a caramelizing process. In any case, says the Mishnah Berurah Nois Katan Yud Gimel, Ve'ein mematkin oisai begacheles. You cannot sweeten the mustard, kederech sheregilin b'chol, which is, this is the way it was typically done during the week, lahaniach b'soichai gacheles, to submerge in the pile of mustard seed a burning coal, val yedei kein mismatek, and by doing this, it would have the effect of sweetening the mustard. Ice cut in Yudalid, you're not allowed to do this with a gacheles shel eitz. Why not? Mishum kibui, because by submerging the burning hot coal into the mustard seed, you're going to extinguish the coal. That's the malacha of kibui. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, now even though you're doing this kibui l'tzarech haichal nefesh, what's the problem? I'm doing kibui in order to process the mustard. That's not machshirei haichal nefesh, that's haichal nefesh. So what's the problem? Why is it asur? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, ha'efshar la'asai saimei esmael, va'asaru midrabanan. This is something which could have been done even prior to Yom Tov, and therefore the Chazal answered it. And since the reason we're answering it is because it's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim, if it was efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim, it would be mutter. Now I had a problem over here. Again, why are we differentiating over here? Why are we saying that there's a difference over here, whether it's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim or efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim? L'chara, this is not machshirei haichal nefesh. This is mamish haichal nefesh. So what's the difference if it's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim or it's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim? Understand the question, Rabbi Sai? The question I have over here is, by haichal nefesh gufa, by haichal nefesh itself, we don't differentiate between efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim or efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim. You're allowed to make a roast on Yom Tov. You're allowed to do bishul. You're allowed to make the fire on Yom Tov to cook your roast, even if it was efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim. So why is the Mishnah Berurah telling me over here that he says it's tzarech haichal nefesh? You're extinguishing the coal by submerging it in the mustard, but it's asur because it was efshar la'asaysay me'esmael. It's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim. So what? But if it's efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim, then you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov itself. By haichal nefesh, there's no difference between efshar la'asaysay miba'ayim or not. So I think what you have to say is that this is being said, and this is quoted. This is quoted. It's not a Magen Avram. It's a Rashi. My thought process is that this has to be according to the Shita of the Ramah. Give me a second. My thought process over here, I think, is you have to say that this is according to the Shita of the Ramah that we had earlier, where the Ramah said that there are those that are machmir even on Eichel Nefesh itself, that if it's Esher La'asaysay Miba'ay Yom, you should do it Miba'ay Yom and you shouldn't do it on Yom Tov. Because again, this is something that's Eichel Nefesh Gufa. It's not Machshir Eichel Nefesh. Okay. And now the Chavetz Chaim brings down that there are those that are machmir and say that even if it's you still are not allowed to do this on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to extinguish the coal in the mustard seed. And I think the reason for that is, we said this earlier, is because the truth is that this whole process of extinguishing the coal in the mustard seed, it was only done by the mifunakim. It was only done by the feinschmeckers that wanted that extra sweetness in the mustard. That's not a davar hashava l'chol nefesh. And if it's not a davar hashava l'chol nefesh, it's not mutter even l'tzarech l'chol nefesh. Ice cotton tezvav, so you're not allowed to do this with a burning wooden coal, but b'shamatchis mutter. But with a hot piece of metal, you are allowed to submerge that into the mustard seed to sweeten it. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, why is that true? Because the einenu bayer, because a piece of metal is not burning, it's not on fire. V'leka kiboy midaraisa, and the malacha of kiboy, of extinguishing, does not apply to a hot piece of metal. Midaraisa, midrabanan it does. V'af agav diyesh by iser kiboy midrabanan, even though you do have kiboy and iser of kiboy midrabanan on a hot piece of metal, hitiru mishum simchas yamtiv. Over here they were matter it for simchas yamtiv purposes. And as far as using hot stones for this purpose, I'm a machzah shekel. Because of the Magen Avraham writes to me, I time off for the same reason. Mortal litain shpud shal matchis malubin l'soich mashke. You're allowed to submerge a burning hot metal spit into some kind of a beverage. Kedei sheyischametz. Now, literally, that means so that it should ferment. I'm not sure what's going on over here. You're allowed to do this if you're preparing this beverage for use on that day of Yom Tov, because it's not kiboy da'araisa to submerge the hot metal spit into the beverage. It's only midrabanan, and they're matter it for simchas Yom Tov. V'ayin bebir halacha de la'apaiskim shesayvrim tetzira fu da'araisa ein lahakel bazer. According to the paiskim who hold that the process of refining metal is an issa da'araisa, then you shouldn't do this to submerge a hot metal into liquid, because that would be the malacha of refining. Okay, now we go to Siv Dalet. Says the Mechaber on the bottom line. Ein toilin hamishameres b'yom tov l'sanein b'shmorim. You're not allowed to, literally this means hang, you're not allowed to set up a filter, a strainer, on Yom Tov, and this is a strainer that was used to strain out the sediments from wine. But if the strainer was already set up, and I'm going to explain what this means in a moment, then mutter litin bashmarim l'sananan, then you are allowed to pour in the wine to strain out the sediments. Now, what are we speaking about over here? Apparently, what they used to do was would want to strain out sediments from wine or from other types of beverages that had sediments in them. So what they would do is they would take a very fine cloth that was basically shaped like a sack. It had a round opening on top, and it came down and it came to a point on the bottom. Now they would take this, they would insert it into a keli. So let's say insert it into a deep pot, and you take the top, the opening of this strainer, and you stretch it around and over the opening of the pot. So now you have this straining sack, this straining bag, like a cheesecloth, is supported by the top of the pot, and now you pour your wine through the filter, and the good wine goes down through the cheesecloth, right, through the strainer into the pot, and then you snap off the strainer fabric from the pot, you pull it out, and you have successfully separated the dregs, the sediments, from the liquid. Now, the Mechaber says you are not allowed to set this up on Yom Tov. And this comes from a Mishnah in Shabbos, on Kuf Lamed Vav Amud Beis. This is a Beferish Mishnah. Now, what's wrong with doing this? What's the problem? Again, let's remind ourselves. It's not a problem of straining, right? Because let's remember, Berurah is mutter. You're allowed to do Berurah on Yom Tov, as long as you're doing the Berurah in a way where it doesn't look like you're doing it liyamim harbe. As long as it's clear that you're doing it l'tzarech hayayim, you're doing it for Yom Tov, Berurah is mutter on Yom Tov. So it's not a Berurah problem. The problem over here apparently is uvda dechayil. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's cotton tezayin on the bottom line of Kuf Chavav Amud Beis. Ein toilin, you're not allowed to hang or support the strainer on Yom Tov. Hainu, what this means is shemaiseach pi hamishameres, that you stretch out the top opening of the strainer al gabe keli be'igel, on top of the round opening of the keli, on top of the round opening of the pot. So you stretched out the straining sack over the opening of the keli. You're not allowed to do that. V'nase ka'oyel al chalal hakli. And once it's snapped onto the top of the keli, it's kind of like making an oil, like making a temporary shelter inside the pot, kind of like you're covering up the pot. Umishum hachi asru, and for this reason they said this is forbidden. The heavy ka'uvda dechayil. The Gemara seems to come out that the problem over here is an uvda dechayil problem. When you set up a strainer in this fashion, that looks, I'm not 100% sure if the point is that it's an uvda dechayil, it looks like you're engaging in a weekday activity. This is something that was generally done during the week. It's something you decided to strain out a batch of wine. So I think there's also a piece over here that, again, it's something that was done liyamim harbe. It's an activity that was done during the weekday, which you didn't generally do this just for a cup of Cabernet for your Yom Tov meal. This is an uvda dechayil. It's something, it's an activity that you sat down to do during the week to strain a batch of wine. So you're not allowed to set this up on Yom Tov. We're not talking about that you're not allowed to do the act of straining. You're not allowed to set it up on Yom Tov, because the setting it up on Yom Tov, somebody looks at what you're doing, this doesn't look like you're busy on Yom Tov. This looks like you're like a weekday. This looks like you're engaged in weekday activity. That's not a Yom Tov thing. It's not Yom Tov Dik, right? You tell your kids, it's not Yom Tov Dik. Don't do that on Yom Tov. You're going out to the street to play basketball. It's not Yom Tov Dik, right? So you don't set up a straining apparatus on Yom Tov. That's uvda dechayil. But that's why the Mechaber says you're not allowed to set it up. But take a look at the top line of Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Avalim hoisa tluya v'oimedes. If it was already set up, mutter litin bashmarim l'sananan. Now you're allowed to go ahead and pour through the wine and do the straining, because Berurah is mutter on Yom Tov. So the act of the straining is not a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah nice cut in Yud Zayin, l'sananan. You're allowed to strain it. And here again, we're going to have a little bit of a problematic Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Umayri, we're talking here, when the Mechaber says that this is mutter to do on Yom Tov, when is that true? That if you would have done it before Yom Tov, there would be a cost to Yom Tov. Somehow, if you would strain it before Yom Tov, it wouldn't taste as good. So it's kind of because if there's no cost to Yom Tov by doing it on Erev Yom Tov, so then you should have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Then, says the Mishnah Berurah, Aser Mishum Berurah. Then it's Aser, because it's a Berurah, and it's Efshal Asay Mibal Yom. What? Again, Berurah is mutter, and this is Eichel Nefesh. You're doing it L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh. It's not Machshirei Eichel Nefesh. It's Berurah for Eichel Nefesh, which is mutter on Yom Tov, whether it's Efshal Asay Mibal Yom or Efshal Asay Mibal Yom. So why is the Mishnah Berurah telling me over here that the reason this is mutter is because it's Efshal Asay Mibal Yom? Because if you would have done it Mibal Yom, it wouldn't taste as good. Why? Now he brings this down. If you'll take a look at Ice Cut Yudal in the Sharitzian, he brings this down from the Magen Avram. And again, you have to say that this is going according to the Ramah that we saw earlier, who says that even Tzarech Eichel Nefesh, if it's just as good if you would have done it Miba'ad Yom, you should do it Miba'ad Yom. But the Mishnah Berurah told us that we're not noyig that way. We're noyig like the Mechaber, that something that's Eichel Nefesh itself is mutter, even if it's Efshar L'Asaysay Miba'ad Yom. So this Magen Avram has to be like that Ramah. He has to be going according to the Ramah, not according to the Mechaber. And this is just like the halacha that we saw by the mustard seed in Siv Gimel, where again the Mishnah Berurah said that this is only if it's Yef Shalah Saisai Miba'ad Yom. Okay, you know what? Let's go a little bit weiter. Says the Mechaber here on the top line of Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. So you're not allowed to set up the strainer because that's of the Dechayil. If the strainer is already set up, you're allowed to use it because that's Berurah and that's Eichel Nefesh and it's Mutter and Yom Tov. Says the Mechaber, Uma'arim, you could make a halachically acceptable little trick over here. If you didn't have the strainer set up and you want to strain out your Cabernet on Yom Tov, you could make a halachically acceptable ha'arama. Uma'arim, you could use a trick, the Toila Oisa, and you could set up the strainer, Litain bar remainim, in order to put fruit, to put pomegranates inside. So you want to strain your Cabernet. You forgot to set up the strainer. You want to set up the strainer. You're not allowed to set up the strainer. It's uvda d'chayil. Why is it uvda d'chayil? Because somebody who looks and sees what you're doing, it looks like you're sitting down in your kitchen to get ready to strain a batch of Cabernet. That's a weekday activity, not a Yom Tov activity, not Yom Tov dik. So you know what you do? You take the pot, you take the strainer, you set it up, and then you take pomegranates and you put it inside. Oh, you're not sitting down to strain a batch of Cabernet. You just needed someplace convenient to keep your fruit. And maybe, so why didn't you put the fruit straight into the pot? Why do you need the strainer? I don't know. Maybe you want to be able to whip out the strainer together with the pomegranates and sling it over your shoulder and go to your neighbor. I don't know. But you didn't do it for straining activity. You did it to store your fruit. Oh, so you could set up the strainer in order to put in Rimonim, and then put in Rimonim, then take the Rimonim out, and then use it to do your straining. And that is a halachically acceptable harama. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yudches. Umarim v'toyle, you can make this harama and you can set up the strainer. Pirush, the explanation of this is, if you didn't have the strainer set up from before Yom Tov, yachal harim, you could make this harama, and you could set it up, liten b'metchila, remind him, in order to use it at first for the storage of remind him. I was cutting your test, liten bar remind him, the noisen bar remind him betchila. However, you do have to first use it for the remind him. You can't set it up and say, tra-la-la-la-la, I'm setting it up for my remind him, and then pour the Cabernet in it. That you're not allowed to do. You have to actually use it for the remind him. The nice bar remind him etchila. If you don't use it for remind him at all, then it's very clear that you did this for straining purposes, and then it's of the chayil and it's awesome. Let's just finish off this sif already. Let's see the Ramah. The Ramah says here on the second line, Hagah, Usha'ar dine sinun b'Yom Tov, as far as all of the other halachas of straining, of filtering on Yom Tov, K'may b'Shabbos, the same halachas that we saw previously in Hilchas Shabbos, K'di Isa Siman Shin Yotes, like we have discussed in Hilchas Shabbos and Siman Shin Yotes. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Chaf, b'Yom Tov K'may b'Shabbos, the halachas of straining are the same on Shabbos as well as on Yom Tov. What is he referring to here? Certainly they're not the same. There are types of Berurah and straining and sifting that we saw you're allowed to do on Yom Tov that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ramaz Bazeh, what the Ramah is hinting to over here is Masha Mavura La'el Sham, what we discussed earlier in Hilchas Shabbos and Siman Shin Yotes, B'Sif Yud and Sif Yud, the Asal Sanein Mayim, that you're not allowed to filter water Besudar, using a cloth, Mishum Libun, because when you take a shmata, you take a cloth and you filter water through it, you're also washing the cloth. That would be kibbutz. That would be the halacha of washing, of laundering. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. So too on Yom Tov, there are times that you're not allowed to filter water using a cloth because of the isser of laundering. V'ayin sham in Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Lamed Zayin, where the Mishnah Berurah over there says that there are exceptions to that rule, and that is that that's only true if it's a regular cloth. But let's say you have a cloth that's miyuchad for filtering. This cloth is a water filter. If it's a water filter, we're not afraid that you're going to wash the cloth. That's not what you're trying to do. Adarabah. You know that the cloth is going to get dirty by the filtering process, and you're okay with that. Buy a regular cloth. We're afraid that you're going to use it as a filter, and then you're going to wash it out because you want the cloth to be clean. So over there, we have to worry about the issur of kibbutz. But over here, if you're using a filter cloth, then we are not worried about it. V'hu adin kan. Okay? That concludes Sif Dalet, and we'll stop over here. Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. We'll continue with Sif Hey. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand Gans Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rosh Hashanah should protect Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshuas and Refuas and Parnasa, everything that everyone needs. We have a good gebenched yar. And with Hashem, I'll see you tomorrow. Be well.